All right, so here we go. Take two. Kyle and I are here to talk about sort of the visioning process and how we try to mature digital object management practices at GVSU. All right, so before we dive in, just thought we should tell you about ourselves. My name is Max Eckert. I'm the Metadata and Digital Curation Librarian, so it's kind of a mouthful. Sometimes people ask me what that means, and sometimes I forget, so I wrote it down. I provide leadership and guidance in the development of data management strategies that will support discovery, access, management, and preservation of the university's digital assets and resources.
And I'm Kyle Felker. I'm the Digital Initiatives Librarian, which is a fairly meaningless title, so I usually describe myself as Chief Instigator of the New, or Sexy Technology Guy.
Yep. So here's an outline of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of a background about digital object management at Grand Valley and some of the challenges that we've encountered. Then Kyle's going to jump in and talking about the visioning process itself and some of the preliminary results of that process. And then we're going to kind of tag team the takeaways at the end. So, background. For those of you who don't know, Grand Valley State University is a 4-year public institution. We have about 25,000 students. We're a master's large university according to the Carnegie classification, so we're pretty big. We're a comprehensive university, but at the same time, we're not an R1. And in fact, the university's focus is not on research, it's actually on teaching. And this is kind of an interesting statistic from our president's office to give you an idea of the kind of resources that we're talking about. As a whole, our state appropriation per fiscal year equated student has actually gone down since the 80s. So, and then the university libraries, here's our mission statement. We're here to enrich the educational mission of the university by advancing intellectual growth and discovery. Through the acquisition, application, dissemination, and preservation of knowledge, we promote teaching, learning, and active scholarship. And just had to throw this slide in here. It's a pretty exciting time at the library. We just moved into this beautiful new building, the Mary Ida Pugh Library. We sort of joke that it looks a little bit like a sand crawler from Star Wars. Does anybody see the resemblance if it had like wheels or anything like that? So yeah, it's pretty high-tech, new age stuff. Okay, so what Kyle and I are calling digital object management, the university libraries have been engaged in for quite some time. So all the way back in 2005, we started our digital collections. This is kind of like digitized highlights of special collections and university archives materials, although more and more these days we're also talking about born digital acquisitions. In 2008, we started our institutional repository, ScholarWorks at GVSU. So this showcases the scholarly and creative output of the university. In 2012, that's when I started, we made our sort of first good faith effort at collecting born digital institutional records. So these records had actually been created digitally since 2006. So there's quite a big gap there, but this was the first year that we piloted a project to ingest them in their sort of native digital format. Last year, we got really interested in learning objects, so this is a little bit more of a kind of loose catch-all category that we use to describe any kind of digital material that a professor or instructor might create as part of their teaching responsibilities. So this could be a range of things. It could be a video or a podcast of a lecture that may or may not have any long-term value or, in fact, any value at all outside of a particular context. To open educational resources. So these are digital textbooks, essentially, that we put into our institutional repository that definitely do have long-term value. They're very unique, and they have a much more wide-ranging audience. And then, just this year, we sort of unveiled a new suite of services and infrastructure related to research data management. So some of these are very technical and hands-on. The majority, though, are actually educational, consultative, and they have to do with the whole life cycle of research data management. So we've been at this for a while and enjoyed some early successes. So one of the things we were able to do was provide new educational opportunities by making unique digital resources available to GVSU faculty and students, particularly with some of the collaborative projects we were doing in the university archives. We were getting really high use in the classroom, and I mentioned those open educational resources. We're able to provide much wider and broader access to those. They're easier to access and can potentially even save students and instructors money. We were able to provide wider, more open access to our collections, so we weren't limited in the same way we were in kind of the print world to just kind of on-campus, single-use GVSU faculty, staff, and students. We were better at preserving institutional memory. So I mentioned that 6-year gap where things were being created digitally, and we didn't record any of that. So we're getting better at that. And then finally, we also get to do some fun stuff. So by even having kind of a baseline of kind of digital curation services in place, we're able to do even funner things like take on bigger and more complex collections, do things like crowdsourcing initiatives, and even basic data visualizations. So things were going pretty well until they weren't. So it wasn't all wine and roses, and we ran into some challenges too. And they largely fell into these 3 categories. So staffing and infrastructure, preservation, that's one of my favorite things to talk about, and then a kind of higher level, more fuzzy one, definition of scope, our role and planning. So in the area of staffing and infrastructure, our collections were sort of growing. It seems like exponentially growing. So we used to measure potential acquisitions in gigabytes, and these days we measure them in terabytes. And as far as item count, sometimes somebody would try to give us hundreds of items at a time, and just a couple months ago somebody tried to give us 18,000. So our collections were growing. But we had a real lack of technical infrastructure to support that growth. And in fact, maybe even more important, we had a lack of human infrastructure to support that growth. So even though our collections were growing and our responsibilities were growing, the number of people we had devoted to these kinds of projects was staying the same. So this led to workload issues. We were kind of really focused on what I would call like heads-down technician type processing work for these digital collections, which meant that we didn't have a whole lot of time for things like outreach and education to tell people about what we were doing, and other value-added services, things like usability tests or preservation actions, those kind of things that can support what you're doing. Metadata, that's in my job title, that was happening very sort of inconsistently and in a sometimes very unstructured way. It definitely wasn't ever happening for items, like item level metadata wasn't really created that often, so that's problematic for a number of reasons. And then finally, there was really a knowledge gap that was kind of emerging. So this existed both outside the library about people not knowing what growing expertise the library had in this area, but also sometimes it even happened inside the library in different silos. In the area of preservation, again, this is something I'm very passionate about. We were focused, so that whole timeline that I showed was totally focused on access. We didn't have any lifecycle orientation at all. I know you all have seen OAIS or the DCC curation lifecycle model, so you know that access is only sort of one small part of the whole process. There's a lot that should happen before that, a lot that should happen after that, and none of those things were happening, and in fact, we were sort of disproportionately focused on providing access. Which meant that we weren't able to ensure long-term preservation of that access. So this sort of manifested itself in some very, what I would call even like basic baseline digital preservation activities like backing up institutional repository content. But we certainly weren't doing anything more full-level preservation like file format migrations or normalizations or that kind of thing. So this was all exacerbated by the fact that our collections were getting much bigger and bigger. I mentioned that. But also more complex. So we were no longer just talking about sort of simple digital objects, but also things like websites and databases or interactive resources, things with a lot of moving parts that are hard to preserve. This is something that I kind of blame myself for. We had a hard time communicating sort of a sense of urgency to people in the library administration that are in control of funds and resources. And so I think that's really a storytelling kind of thing, but we're going to talk about that later. And then finally, this kind of higher level definition of scope, our role and planning. In general, we had a real lack of policies and procedures that informed what we were doing. All the decisions that we made for all the different types of collections we were collecting were totally ad hoc. We had a real lack of day-to-day planning, and then maybe even worse, we had a lack of long-term planning to sort of inform our day-to-day activities to make sure that they were in line with the direction that the institution as a whole wanted to go. Our scope wasn't well defined in any of these areas, so we said yes, sometimes when we shouldn't have. We weren't doing any assessment, and in fact, we didn't really even have a definition for what success would look like in the area of digital curation or preservation. And so, because we didn't have the definition, it was hard to do in the first place, but then when people would come and ask us, why are you doing what you're doing, it was hard for us to articulate the importance of what we were doing for the organization. In areas like research data management, we were pretty much totally unaware of faculty needs in this area, so that was kind of a problem we had to solve. In areas like institutional records, everything is totally decentralized at universities, so we didn't even really know where to start to look for records. Our role, we weren't sure if we should be like a repository and have a very technical and hands-on role for all this data that was being created, or if it should be more educational or consultative, more higher level. And this really informed our relationship with other campus stakeholders. So sometimes this meant, we could point our finger at campus IT because, y'all can't keep up with our digital storage needs, come on. But other times, really, the blame was on us because we weren't sort of fostering the right partnerships on campus with other stakeholders that were involved in the same types of processes that we were trying to get involved in. So, to make a long story short, we were way too informal about all of this, and before long, we started to feel kind of overwhelmed and overloaded. And so, like all good libraries, we created a committee to kind of look at what we were doing and to outline digital object management practices and mature them at Grand Valley State University.
Hey, do you want to answer my next one?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about the process that we went through, and that means talking to you about strategic planning, because that's really what we were engaging in. So I'm going to spend most of the time that I have talking to you about strategic planning, about its importance to digital object management, how we did it at GVSU, and hopefully from that extract some sort of general observations that will be helpful to you. So, strategic planning seems like it should be really simple, right? It's about answering some pretty baseline questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Who are we doing it for? What is it that we want our efforts to look like, and what challenges are standing in our way? What is it that's keeping us from reaching that point? And it's really necessary, that sort of planning, when you're doing digital object management. Next slide. Because it's so resource intensive. It's so expensive in terms of staff time and software and specialized equipment. Because the field is so technical, it's constantly changing, so there's this learning curve you're constantly grappling with. But also because you have this variety of audiences. So you have people in the university shoving stuff at you all the time saying, look, this is really important, but I just can't deal with it, so you need to take custodianship of it. And then even within the library, you have different priorities about what you're going to be doing. Upper-level administrators want you to do really whiz-bang, high-profile projects that they can use to impress other libraries and other universities. Middle managers just want you to do like a project that has a defined scope and doesn't completely drain my budget, please, thank you. And so you have, subject librarians want you to do projects for their departments because, of course, their departments are the most important departments on campus. So all of this stuff, and then there's this variety of file formats, all of which have different needs. Video, audio, images, text files, all of those have to be dealt with differently, and some of them are more resource intensive than others. And all of this stuff makes it absolutely necessary that you be able to articulate a strategic plan about what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, because you're always going to have more projects than you have resources. Unfortunately, it's that stuff that makes it so necessary that also makes it so difficult to create a strategic plan. So, there are two sorts of general strategies that you can do, two sorts of broad camps. The first is deliberate strategy. That's where you sit down before you do anything, and you say, this is what we want our efforts to look like. These are the goals that we're trying to reach. These are the metrics we're going to use to see whether or not we've reached those goals. And then you impose that on reality, your vision on reality. Libraries don't tend to do a whole lot of this. Right? So what we do is we do emergent strategy, right, where we take custody of a particular collection, or we enter into an agreement with a particular department, or we do a couple of pilot projects, and then things sort of snowball, and before we know it, we're taking charge of collections that we never even thought we would be taking charge of. And then your challenge is to sort of draw some coherency out of your efforts to date and articulate that in a way that makes sense. And so that's exactly what we're doing at GVSU. So, like Max said, we formed a committee because that's what we do. And this had a couple of different people on it: the Digital Initiatives Librarian, me, our archivist, our head of collection development, who's sort of a middle management position in our library, one of our liaison librarians, our associate dean of technology, who is my boss's boss. And let me tell you, if you've never chaired a committee that has your boss's boss on it, you're missing out. especially when you have to tell him he's wrong about something. And then finally, our metadata and digital curation librarian. So right away, we have this challenge in that we have this huge variety of perspectives, right? We have these people like the liaison librarian who's outside the work entirely, but knows that it's important and wants it done for her department. We have people like Max and Nancy, our archivist, who are very, very close to that work and are very concerned with the very nitty-gritty issues that they're dealing with every day. You have our associate dean of technology who knows this stuff is important but has no idea how it gets done and is looking at all of this at a much higher sort of vantage point. So right away we have this clash of perspectives that's going to be a challenge for us. And the charge that we were given from our dean was actually fairly specific. We needed to clarify our priorities, what was important for us to do, what was not important for us to do, and why. What was our role? Was it technical? Was it advisory? What specifically were we doing with regards to all of these different kinds of objects? And then we had to discuss, this was really important, the challenges that we were facing and what it is, at least in broad terms, that we needed to start addressing those challenges. And we had to do it in a way that she could take to our provost and say, this is why I need more resources for the library. This is why I need new positions. This is why I need new money. This is why I need new technology. So it had to be understandable by somebody who was not a librarian, who did not have a technical background. It had to be written in English, and it had to be really short, because as we know, administrators have very short attention spans. Sorry. So we met a couple of times as a committee, and we just sort of started trying to talk, and that did not work out so well. Right, again, because we had all these different clashes of perspectives, and the issues were so huge, we could not ground the discussion. It sort of meandered far and wide, and went into unexpected holes and corners, and we couldn't dig it out again. So those first couple of meetings were not terribly productive. What we needed was structure, right? We needed a way to structure that conversation so that we could deal with the issues one at a time, and so that we could focus our attention. Now, there are lots of different ways that you can structure a strategic planning process that already exists. Like there's SWOT analysis, which is strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. There's balanced scorecard, which is a little bit more metrics-driven. There's scenario planning that comes to us from the US military. Each one of these has a strength or a weakness for a particular kind of conversation. And I think that part of the reason that strategic planning gets such a bad rap generally is because people apply the tools indiscriminately. Like they just throw a SWOT analysis at something without thinking about, well, you know, is this going to give me the outcome that I want? So just for instance, I thought I would take you a little bit through balanced scorecard. So this was developed by a business professor and a consultant at Harvard University. And the problem that they were trying to solve with this is how can we give companies a way to formulate strategies that can then connect to metrics, especially for large organizations, so that they can clarify their objectives and then see whether or not the organization as a whole is addressing those objectives. And that means that it's a very top-down strategy, it's a very deliberate kind of strategy tool, and that it's very metrics-driven. And that makes it very unsuitable for the conversation that we were trying to have at GWSU. So if I had just thrown balanced scorecard at this, it would not have worked. Our objectives were just to clarify how our disparate areas related, like how our scholarly communication related to our archives and that sort of thing. What our challenges were, that was super important. Articulating in a way that people outside the library could understand why that was important to the university as a whole, and then sort of trying to create some clarity about how we were going to begin addressing those things. It was really about clarity and communication. So what we did, we created our own framework. So this is an option too. If none of the existing frameworks work for you, you can make your own. And we created these sort of 6 broad categories that the types of objects that we were dealing with fell into. And these sort of grew out of the way our library apportioned out the work. And so just to give you an example, for one of the categories is, and then for each of those categories, we articulated the scope of that category. What sort of object fell into this category? What sort of object did not fall into this category? Sometimes we approached clarity by talking about what the category didn't mean. And we talked about why we were interested in dealing with that sort of object. Who for? Was there a primary and secondary audience? Were they inside or outside the university? And then, and only then, were we really ready to start talking about challenges. So just to give you an example, our learning objects category, we defined this as digital objects created by instructors for use in classroom instruction which have enduring value, meaning their lifespan is measured in years, and original and substantive intellectual content, and which have a potential audience which extends beyond the class for which they were originally created. So it's fairly specific. Okay, so why are we interested in those sorts of objects? Well, they directly relate to the primary teaching mission of our university. But also, having those objects accessible to people outside the university raises the profile of the university. So there's a secondary audience outside the university. Okay, so challenges. What are the challenges here? Obviously, the complexity of the objects. If an object is, say, an interactive web page, then there's scripts and images and web pages and all sorts of moving parts, and that makes it very difficult for us to take custodianship of an object like that. And that also makes preservation a challenge, right? If you want to make an interactive web page accessible to somebody 20 years from now, then you basically have to emulate the environment in which it runs. That is a major challenge. And also in our definition, there's this implication about quality, about enduring value, and about value outside the particular class for which it's created. The problem there is that we are not necessarily chemists or education majors or English majors, and so making that judgment about quality is very tricky. And so one of the things we talked about is, can we locate part of that quality process in the department itself? So when we finished with this, we had 6 pages worth of really technical, dense, specific language, which was awesome, but not useful for the purpose for which we were being convened. So what we did was we took all the major challenges that we identified and we grouped them into thematic areas. And those thematic areas are basically Max's earlier challenge slide. We agreed on an overall structure of the document. We would put our scope stuff first, and then we would talk about the majority of the document would be devoted to challenges, and then we'd talk a little bit about where we wanted to be at the end. We had to focus on our audience, again, so we had to keep in mind that this was a non-librarian and a non-technical person who was going to consume this document, so we rewrote the hell out of it. I think we went through 6 or 7 drafts before we finally had something that was 3 pages long and couched in language that we thought a non-librarian could understand. So a result of that, when we were done with all of that work, we identified these sort of 3 major challenge areas for us: staffing and infrastructure, definition of scope, and preservation. Things that we have started doing as a result of having done this process. We've hired 2 new staff, or we are hiring 2 new staff. An assistant archivist and, what is the name of the...
It's like a publishing librarian that'll work in our scholarly communications area.
Right. We know that we need to do more detailed planning about our software and hardware needs, so we've convened a working group of people who are much closer to the work, who are going to look at 5 years out, what we need to get, where we need to go in the next 5 years. Our collection development policies really need to be revised. They needed to articulate what we were collecting and why, and what we were not collecting. That was the piece that was often missing. So for example, with learning objects, the complexity of that stuff and our lack of infrastructure means that there's just a hard limit on what kind of objects we can take custodianship of. And our policies needed to communicate that for clarity inside and outside the library. We know that we need to create a comprehensive preservation plan, and part of that is also the planning for the software and hardware needs, because we need a whole lot more storage. So we have another working group that's working on that. We need to do more research on data management needs, because we just don't know what it is that researchers need from us. So we have a plan where Max and I and a couple of other people are going to go out and do some interviews with faculty and gather some information about their data management needs so that we can use that to create some new services. And once we've done all of that, we're going to be better positioned to talk to people like Campus IT about what it is that we need and why it's important. So we'll be able to foster better working relationships with other people on campus.
So, some takeaways.
So we were thinking about, like, what is it that you can abstract from this that might be useful? I think it's really helpful if you're going to do any kind of document object management or digital object management to learn a little bit about strategic planning. Not because you're going to use SWOT or balanced scorecard or something like that, but because it gets you started thinking about how you structure these sorts of high-level conversations. And I think even if you're a line worker going in, to your first job, like Max, you could be asked to be involved in this sort of process.
So your short-term efforts, they will eventually have to be formalized. So like Kyle said, everything sort of emerges from the ground up. You do a lot of work, kind of heads down technician type work at the beginning, and then you start doing a lot more of that and a lot more in all kinds of different areas, and eventually you have to take a step back, sit down, and kind of create a plan, a formal plan.
Right, because decisions you make about processing on your first project, you start abstracting maybe to your next project where they're maybe not so appropriate, and sooner or later you have to step back and question that. Communication is super important, especially in academic libraries. So we're very siloed off because you're typically faculty and you have this autonomy to do what you think is important, which is awesome and fantastic, except that you also have to make sure that you remember that your efforts relate to other efforts in the library, and there has to be time set aside for you to talk to other people about what you're doing, which is basically what we did as part of this process.
And then mapping your efforts to institutional values. So I mentioned earlier that we had a really hard time at sort of articulating the value of what it was we were doing until we thought of what we were doing in terms of the teaching mission of the university. So once we could sort of prove that what we were doing directly affected classrooms and affected student learning, then people started to listen a whole lot more.
Technology, not just about technology. This is something Max and I talk about a whole lot. I've been managing technology in libraries for about years now, and one of the things that I've learned is that the hardest part of dealing with library technology or technology in general is not learning a new programming language or setting up a server or figuring out how the latest new whiz-bang I-read lip thing works. It's all about trying to articulate to people why the technology is necessary, why the disruption that it causes is going to be important or bearable, or you can get through it, or you need to get through it, and what the benefit is going to be to the library at the other end.
And so I think that's pretty closely related to storytelling. So, like Kyle said, it's not just about sort of getting new hardware, getting new software. It's about storytelling. You have to sort of teach people about why you're doing what you're doing, and sort of tell a story about how what it is that you're doing is going to sort of improve the organization.
Right, so before Max came, we really paid very little attention to digital preservation, and that's been sort of a tough sell for us. So, what Max is trying to do in a lot of cases is tell us a story about what our library is going to look like in 15 years if we don't do this.
So yeah, the end.
Questions? So is your final output document available for the rest of us to look at somewhere?
Actually, it is. It's on a blog.
The whole process is available if you're really interested.
Yeah.
I'm super crazy about documenting things, so yeah.
That's great. That's really good, because I think a lot of us go through these similar kinds of things, and your whole idea about let's not reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
Let's work together as a community, a large community, to help each other.
It's really kind of funny. The very first entry in that blog is really confusing because it sort of reflected, very first.
And then it gets rewritten a couple times.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Well, we'll put that up on our blog too for the overall colloquium today, so that we can make sure that we share that, because that is fabulous information, and that's why we are hosting this today. I mean, we have to talk to each other about our projects.
Sure.
Any other questions?
No, I would say it's very, I find I'm practically speechless when I'm supposed to articulate what I'm doing and why I'm doing it to my stakeholders. And that won't really work with people who don't know what you are doing in the first place.
Yeah, I find that's true sometimes even, within the library, people who are sort of already on your side, they don't know enough about what it is that you're doing in order to talk to people outside the library about why that area is important.
Right, and so your friend there, I think, are things like metaphor and simile and the same sorts of things that storytellers use. Like one of the things I keep trying to get Max to do is sort of describe digital preservation to our library in terms of bit rot and decay, which is something that we understand.
And I think it's a little dramatic, but...
Maybe shadow puppets. Anybody else? Thank you so much. You've done a lot of work.